to do is give you a little bit more of a recent historical perspective that informs the actors' incentives and the way that they view the world, and that is going to hopefully inform your understanding when you go off and you read about the points of tension, the disagreements, and the security issues, problems, conflicts that these states find themselves in. Some helpful journals and sources for studying East Asian security. These tend to be very good, accessible journals. Real quick, NBR, it's a think tank that's based out of Seattle. It produces some really good publications. It is actually the National Bureau of Asian Research, but I think some other organization had NBAR copyrighted already, so it's just NBR. It's weird. But it stands for National Bureau of Asian Research. And the really cool thing about some of these, like the Chinese Journal of International Politics, Chinese scholars are writing, but it's translated into English, and most of the translations are pretty good. So you can get a pretty good sense of what intellectuals in different security establishments think and how they view the world. ICG, of course, just stands for International Crisis Group. And then some of the major journals that I had mentioned yesterday, International Organization, International Security, World Politics, pretty frequently they will publish articles about Asian security problems, particularly China. Turns out you can make a lot of money writing about China these days. Okay. So, I want to start with North Korea. And part of my motivation for discussing the North Korean nuclear proliferation problem with you is to disabuse any of you of the notion that North Korea is an irrational or crazy actor. Those types of descriptions really fail to capture the nuance of the regional political situation and the internal political situation in North Korea, which we actually have a decent idea what it looks like. And I think often the irrational or crazy label is projected with sometimes some kind of racist underpinnings. So I want to proceed from a rationalist perspective. Very, very quick history of recent proliferation. So North Korea withdrew from the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, in 2003, declared its first successful nuclear test in 2006, declared its nuclear weapons program formally in 2009, conducted a second test in 2009, and then just conducted the third test in February of 2013. So in the last decade, that is where a lot of the major milestones in the development of North Korea's nuclear weapons program have come. The international community presently is not entirely sure, to my knowledge, of how many nuclear weapons North Korea actually has. Some low-end estimates say like 6, some high-end estimates say like 40. So there is some variation in the estimates. In terms of North Korea's actual capabilities, probably have missiles that can threaten Japan, South Korea, and mainland China. And the Taepyeong-2 is the name of the missile that theoretically could hit the western United States, but the most recent test of the Taepyeong-2 failed. So we're okay for right now. Also, a failed satellite test in 2012. There was concern that North Korea had developed ICBM capabilities, and there were photos of ICBMs getting paraded down the street in Pyongyang. A lot of specialists now think that those photos were fake, projecting signals about capabilities you don't really have. So what I'd like to do is give you a little glimpse into the internal politics of North Korea to maybe help you understand the strategic motivations behind what often appears like pretty crazy political theater. So the Kim family history. The Kim family has been in charge of North Korea since Japan was vanquished at the end of World War II. Kim Il-sung was Kim Jong-un's grandfather, and he was a brilliant guerrilla strategist. He was just excellent, but he was a terrible economist. And so he wrote, maybe, probably with some help, the North Korean centrally planned economy state doctrine. It's called Jushur, and everybody has to learn it pretty close to, pretty much need to memorize the writings of Kim Il-sung when they're at the military academies in North Korea. So Kim Il-sung, he takes over North Korea, initiates the centrally planned economy, and actually for about a decade or two, North Korea outproduces South Korea. The North Korean economy is actually better and more stable than the South Korean economy for a decade or two. Then international sanctions hit, and also North Korea experiences a terrible drought and a series of other natural disasters. Turns out centrally planned economies don't react well to exogenous shocks, and so the North Korean economy collapses, and the state turns even more inward and becomes one of the poorest states on the planet. 1994, Kim Il-sung's son, Kim Jong-Il, takes over. Kim Jong-Il spent 30 years getting prepared to ascend to the position of head of state. So he got 30 years worth of grooming. Kim Jong-un, I'm sure you realize now, took over after Kim Jong-il's death in the end of 2011. So there was a sense, or at least a hope, that maybe Kim Jong-un would be something like a reformer, because we knew that he liked Michael Jordan and that he had briefly gone to school in Europe. So Kim Jong-un was probably not actually the first choice to succeed Kim Jong-il. Kim Jong-il had a first son who a lot of people suspected of being groomed to be next in line, but he got caught trying to go to Disneyland in Tokyo on a fake passport. And so he was arrested and sent back, and so he kind of fell out of favor. I think he was trying to travel on like a Jamaican passport or something. What? So he got caught, fell out of favor. Kim Jong-il had a second son who apparently he viewed as too effeminate to run the state. So Kim Jong-un is the next best option. And so there was a feeling, a hope that he might be a reformer. I want to suggest to you that's really not the case. A lot of scholarship that's gotten produced about Kim Jong-un's cabinet shuffles suggests that he is very much keeping with the same strategy for internal political control as Kim Jong-il. Now, you will fairly frequently hear suggestions that North Korea is on the brink of collapse. North Korea can't sustain itself like this forever. Well, it is definitely true that by and large the country is extremely poor. But the elite in North Korea are doing extremely well. And it turns out that all you need to do when the elite are doing well, you just need to keep the military happy, and your state can maintain its position, well, probably into perpetuity. So, if anybody's interested, there is a really good article in the journal International Security. It's by Byman and Lind, and it's called Pyongyang's Survival Strategy. And it's about the different ways that the Kim family has maintained its grip on power over the last couple of decades. And the argument is that the most important factor is patronage for the military. So you might be wondering, how does the Kim family get the money to basically buy the loyalty of the North Korean military? So part of it comes from international aid payments, right? It gets aid from South Korea, China, and sometimes the United States in exchange for promises to scale back its nuclear program that are obviously not credible. It takes that money, obviously does not distribute that money to the population, but rather it goes into the patronage network. Another way of doing it that Byman and Lind suggest that the Kim family has anybody ever heard of an operation called Brink 39? It is apparently this department that exists in the North Korean state that is responsible for getting money from illicit trade. So assisting with narcotics trafficking, illegal weapons trade, rare species and endangered species trafficking. So the Kim family allegedly has its hand in a lot of illicit markets, and that's very profitable. And Room 39 is the organization within the North Korean state that controls those operations.
Is there a book or something on that?
Yeah, the article that I'm mentioning is Byman and Lind are the authors. It's called Pyongyang's Survival Strategy, and then within that article you'll find lots of citations. It's the teensiest bit out of date. It's from 2010, but it appears that Kim Jong-un is keeping with very much the same strategy. Now, there is an interesting dilemma that Kim Jong-un faces in maintaining his political survival, because the Kim family prefers to only give the most important posts to family members, either blood family members or people who are related by marriage. However, the old guard in North Korea is getting older and older, and they're beginning to die off. And so the dilemma Kim has is, how do I bring in fresh blood? How do I bring in new people and still maintain their loyalty? Because the old guard's loyalty is assured, right? They're getting, watches and gold chains and suitcases full of money. But the younger generation is possibly more motivated by profit. And so what Kim Jong-Un does, he has a really vast network of informants. And the people who are rising in the military academy and rising through the North Korean state elite are basically encouraged to tell on each other in order to weed out defectors and basically low commitment applicants to become the next group of elite in North Korea. The other way that Kim Jong-un tries to maintain loyalty in the ascendant ranks is through very, very, very heavy political indoctrination for the people who go through North Korea's universities and military academies. So we don't know too much about who specifically has fallen out of favor and who has been brought into the fold. Most of the time, especially with authoritarian countries, the way that an authoritarian state will signal who is now in the fold is they'll stage photo opportunities. And based on where a person is standing in relation to the head of state, that is usually an indication of who is in what position. And I'm sure there are a lot of people who are analyzing those photos who know way more about it. And so, this is a very common thing, I think, in how we talk about North Korea and in media coverage of North Korea, which is mistaking political theater for acts of irrationality. Here is the international context North Korea finds itself in. A very rich elite in an otherwise deeply impoverished country that has no tax base. So you can't collect taxes, but you need money for the patronage network and to keep the loyalty of the military. So you get aid payments. How do you get the aid payments? The North Korean strategy has been, well, if we build up a nuclear arsenal that A, deters the outside world from attacking us, it makes us appear like a credible threat to regional enemies, and we can also use it basically as a ransoming tool. And that, I would argue, is the strategy. You have to project the image, oh yes, I'm crazy enough to use this, and then point to the massive missiles that you have. But the question of whether or not they would actually use it, don't really know. All that matters is that that sort of bargaining tactic, that extortion tactic works. And it's worked very well for the last decade. Japan, South Korea, China, the United States in total have given like $6 billion to the Kim family in exchange for promises to scale back the North Korean nuclear program that don't really occur. And so it's this grand, really interesting political theater that gets, I think, frequently mistaken for rationality. But if you're a state that has largely been cornered by the international community, it's not a bad strategy. It's also, and Byman and Lin make this argument, building up the nuclear weapons program is a really good way to maintain the loyalty of the military because it bestows prestige upon the military. And it makes the military a more desirable institution to join. Now, the China-North Korea relationship, a lot gets made of it. There are folks on one end of the spectrum who will write that China has basically no control over North Korea. Folks on the other end of the spectrum suggest that China has almost total control over North Korea. Turns out the truth is somewhere in the middle. So the relationship has evolved very, very significantly since the Korean War. China, as you realize, intervened on behalf of North Korea during the Korean War, and they were fairly close allies, slightly different visions of what a communist economy was supposed to look like, but for the most part, they were allies 50s, 60s, until the late 70s. 1979, Deng Xiaoping comes to power. And Deng Xiaoping embarks on this campaign basically to open up China to the rest of the world, realizing that Maoism has largely failed. It was Deng Xiaoping who said it doesn't matter if the cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice, it's a good cat. Right, which is a very, and characteristically roundabout Deng Xiaoping way of saying that capitalism is not as bad as we said it was. Okay, so it's at about that time that North Korea and China begin to diverge in terms of foreign policy. China begins trying to normalize relations with other states and with the international community, whereas North Korea increasingly draws inward. China actually has something called the International Liaison Department, which is a group of people that are supposed to inform the Chinese government about what North Korea is up to in terms of its both domestic political control and its foreign policy predictions. But the information appears to be limited. The International Liaison Department failed to predict like 2 of the last 3 major North Korean missile launches. So I think that would probably suggest that China only has a limited idea of what signals North Korea is going to send to the international community. I can get you the title of the article. The authors are Chung and Choi in 2013 who explain a little bit about the international liaison. And at this point, the elites in both states have significantly different understandings of the international system. China has largely succeeded in re-engaging the international community and establishing itself as a rising power. Elites in North Korea, while they behave rationally, also are indoctrinated to believe that the international system is a tool for the destruction of the Korean people. And so gradually, their foreign policies diverge. Their outlooks diverge, and it becomes a much more complicated and difficult alliance for China to maintain. China now, I think, probably views North Korea as more of a liability than anything else, which makes complete sense. And it was actually, yeah, it was 1992 that China and South Korea normalized relations. And that, Chung and Choi make the argument that that was a major point of rupture in the relationship between North Korea and China. So the takeaway here is that basically the major Asian power, China, is steadily losing control of the direction of North Korean foreign policy and domestic policy. And there is nothing that the international community seems to be able to do to remove the Kim family from power. And so it seems very likely is that for the next many years, barring some major crazy exogenous event that nobody predicted, the status quo is going to remain. Any thoughts or questions about North Korea before we go somewhere else, which is to China? Yes?
Do you know anything about the case on the industrial complex?
Oh, that's the joint business venture on the border, right, between North Korea, it's just inside North Korea. Yeah, so the Kaesong or Kaesong Industrial Complex is this like little industrial park that's just inside the North Korean border, and they bus South Korean workers into the industrial park to work. And I don't know, I guess it's supposed to be like a goodwill gesture between the two. I don't know very much about its profitability.
Apparently, I was reading an article, I use it when I run inside North Korea. They exploit the labor like exponentially.
Interesting.
And they pay South Korean workers like half of the annual minimum wage. Now
Wow.
they like pack millions of people into it, or like a lot of people. It's not. It's like super human rights violation or something.
I believe it. Interesting. Yeah, I'd love to know more about that. Any other thoughts? Okay. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, when you're talking about this, like the theater and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Last night I was reading on the news, and yesterday North Korea announced that it was going to restart the reunion process with South Korea from the 50s when families were ununited.
Right.
And that they were going to start reuniting families. Do you think that's a genuine gesture from North Korea, or is that some sort of tactic that they're using?
So the official line in North Korea is that there should only be one Korea, right? And basically the South Korean economic and political system should go away. And so that sounds like, while it sounds like a humanitarian gesture, and periodically families that were separated by the partition of the Koreas get reunited in high-profile media events. And my understanding is that there's a lot of fluctuation in how frequently it happens, but it's happened, you know, a fair amount over the last couple of decades, every now and again, which means that the fact that it's happening again now is probably not a very credible signal from North Korea about it. But that's just my guess. Anything else? All right, China. Ah, right, yeah, see, they're not quite allies, not quite enemies. So, I want to talk to you a little bit about China's worldview and the historical circumstances that informed China's worldview. There's a really great book that I would recommend to anybody who is interested in the topic. It's by a guy named David Shambaugh, and it's called China Goes Global, The Partial Power. Very accessible, really good at explaining China's worldview and a couple of the major security problems that China faces now, and the dilemma that China finds itself in as both a regional hegemon but a global middle power. So, the dominant strain of thinking in international relations in the Chinese defense circles, so in the universities, in the military academies, and the policy circles, is neorealism. So, I think it's very, there is a lot of very good evidence that would suggest that, to the extent that a state can see the world in such a way, China sees the world in a realist fashion. And it makes sense that that would be true if you consider China's historical experiences with the international community after about 1840. So for a long time, I mean centuries and centuries and centuries, China was very much the center of Asian politics. And it had lots of little tributary kingdoms. So even the kanji for China, middle or center, kingdom or state, middle kingdom, it reflects the belief that China is the center of Asian politics. And that was true until about the 1840s when China started to encounter Europe. And its encounters with European colonialism, unsurprisingly, were very negative. The Opium Wars, you may have heard of. Do you all know what the Opium Wars were? Okay. So the Opium Wars occur, and China is never really formally colonized, but it loses a great deal of face in the international system. And in 1894 to 95, China has a short war with Japan, the First Sino-Japanese War, and Japan wins. So gradually, China is losing its status in the international system. And it views the international system as anarchic, competitive, and pretty brutal. So, for that reason, it makes sense that a lot of the people who write in China about the nature of international institutions or international obligations or transnational security problems, they think about these international obligations as traps that are meant to constrain China. So they see international institutions and obligations as something promulgated by the dominant powers, so namely the United States, in the international system. So when the United States calls on China to do more about global warming, or do more about the war on terror, so all of these international obligations that China is supposed to take on because it's the rising power, the realists in China view that as very much a trap. Yeah?
So this is the explanation for the Kyoto Protocol, why they didn't sign the Kyoto Protocol.
Interesting. I actually have not thought about that, but it would make sense.
Okay.
It would be consistent with that explanation.
Okay.
And so, that is why China finds itself in this weird dilemma where it is a rising power, and not everybody, some people expect it to supplant the United States as the global hegemon, and yet it is engaged in a shirking strategy. It seeks to shirk as much international responsibility as possible and look out for its own self-preservation. And that's in part due to the dominance of realist thinking in the policy circles. China also has a dilemma because it has both internal and external security problems. And in fact, spending by the Chinese state on combating internal security problems outpaced spending on external security problems this last year. More was spent by like $5 billion or so. It's like 117 billion was allocated to internal security measures, and then external security measures, what we would think of as like the People's Liberation Army, got a little bit less, 112 billion. The internal security problems, largely related to questions of separatism. So the Uyghurs in Xinjiang province, is everybody familiar with who the Uyghurs are? Good. Yeah, somebody's nodding. Could somebody tell me about the Uyghurs?
They are a religious minority here in China.
And also an ethnic minority.
Ethnic minority as well. And I'm not sure if they were expelled from Iran or if they had migrated from Iran into China, like right after they established their territory. But basically, they've been kept from participating politically and economically in China, and have been prevented from either leaving China to go back to the Middle East.
And so Uyghurs are primarily found in Xinjiang province, and every now and again there will be clashes between the state security apparatus and the Uyghurs. We actually held some Uyghurs in Gitmo for a while. I don't know if we let them out or not. But yeah, there is a Uyghur separatist group that is categorized by the United States and China as a terrorist organization. Also, of course, Tibet is the perennial issue. And China views it obviously as an internal security problem. And it also views the existence of Taiwan as an internal security problem. But I'm not going to go on for very long about the relationship between China and Taiwan. This also partially, I think, explains why China is very, very sensitive in international organizations about calls for intervention in other sovereign states, which makes total sense. All right. So that might help explain a little bit about China's approach to some major disputes. These are the major claimants on the Spratly Island disputes. You may also hear this referred to as the South China Sea dispute. The South China Sea dispute is actually 9 distinct territorial disputes. The dispute over the Spratlys, the Paracels, and Scarborough Shoal are the ones that receive the most media attention. Spratlys in particular, the waters around it, very rich for fishing, potentially rich in minerals and natural gas. China, Taiwan, Philippines, Brunei, Vietnam, and Malaysia. The major actors who have gotten the most media attention have been China, the Philippines, and Vietnam. The reason that they've been getting the most media attention is because they're the ones who have been coming closest to actual militarized conflict over the competing claims that they have to the Spratlys. So, for example, in 2005, China fired on some Vietnamese fishing boats and said they were pirates. Dangerous waters to go fishing. You're going to get called a pirate. 4 years later, a Chinese sub stalked the USS Impeccable. In 2011, China fired on some Philippine shipping boats. Also cut some cables in Vietnamese ships. So there's basically a military standoff. But before I go on to that, so the Philippines just recently brought suit to the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea Treaty against China. And consistent with the previous explanation about how China views international organizations, China just refuses to participate. It will not acknowledge that a suit has been brought against it. And it makes sense that China would feel that way because the Philippines is a very important ally of the United States, and if you believe that the United States controls the levers of power in most international organizations, you're scared that it will just find in favor of the Philippines. Not because that finding would be objectively correct, but because the United States controls the levers of power. Okay, Senkaku Daoyu is a good lead into Japan, but before we, doing a lot of travel today, before we go to Japan, does anybody have any thoughts, questions, comments, or concerns about China? Okay. So then, the Senkaku Daoyu dispute. This is a group of islands in the East China Sea. They're not the most obviously desirable islands. I don't think anybody lives on them. There might be like a very small group of people that occasionally live on one of the islands, but yeah, largely unpopulated. It's suspected that there are mineral deposits and gas fields, but the total value of the Senkaku Daoyu Islands is not at all clear. In September of 2012, the Japanese state bought the islands from a very wealthy Japanese family that privately owned them. And it's at about that time that the great political theater begins, and it becomes a very important point of national pride, this dispute for both Japan and China. Like, what is this, 11 days ago, Chinese vessels encroached into Japanese territorial waters by the Senkaku Diaoyus and stayed there for like 28 hours, just to kind of show that they could. And so, formally, the Senkakus belong to Japan. Leon Panetta said several months ago that in the event of a conflict, the United States would view the Senkakus as falling within Japan's purview, and so if China were to invade the Senkakus, that would trigger the United States' security commitment to Japan. In so many words, he probably expressed it much more gently, or at least more finely. So those are the Senkaku Diaoyu disputes. Actually, a Chinese organization took out a big ad in the New York Times a couple months ago. It was the centerfold in the world section. You opened it up and it was just a big picture of the Senkaku Diaoyus, and it said, the Diaoyu Islands belong to China. All right. Shinzo Abe. Shinzo Abe is the current Prime Minister of Japan, and he is from the Liberal Democratic Party as opposed to the other major party in Japan, which is the DPJ, the Democratic Party of Japan. And the LDP controlled Japan for a very, very, very long time, briefly interrupted by the DPJ a couple of years ago, and then the LDP was basically voted back in. So Shinzo Abe is a fairly famous hawk in Japanese politics. And fairly recently, 3 members of his cabinet and 102 members of the Diet, which is like Japan's Congress, went to visit a very famous shrine called the Yasukuni Shrine. And this happens every year at the commemoration of Japan's concession in World War II. So Japan gives up suits for peace in World War II. Every year, prominent Japanese politicians make a pilgrimage over to the Yasukuni Shrine, because at the Yasukuni Shrine, there are housed the names of Japanese war dead. So they go to pay their respects there. The reason that this is a point of tension in East Asia is because it also features the name of very prominent war criminals. So war criminals from Japan memorialized at Yasukuni Shrine. I'll get to that in a second. These are some of my pictures of Yasukuni Shrine. I had to go visit. And back here, you will find the names of war dead. The chrysanthemum is the imperial seal. This appears to be a gift shop, or a concession stand of some type. And just outside of the shrine, does anybody recognize this flag?
It's the war flag.
Yeah,
Navy.
It's the naval flag. And so the naval flag has since come to civilize Japanese historical revisionism and Japanese militarism. So as you, I'm sure, realize, Japan had Article 9 written into its constitution by the Supreme Command of the Allied Powers, said you don't get to have an offensive military anymore. But also the deal was you only get to spend like 1% of your GDP on self-defense forces, which is why Japan's self-defense forces are so rad, because their GDP is huge. And it's a self-defense force with attack helicopters and submarines. But outside of Yasukuni Shrine or Jinja, there are all sorts of Japanese nationalist rallies, and this is some photos I took of one of them. I don't know what they're saying over the loudspeakers. My sense is nothing good. He's less intimidating with the birds on him, but yeah, that is the center of the show. Okay, so there we go. So Japan's view of the international environment. There's a lot of tension in it. So for a long time, obviously, Japan has fallen under U.S. security commitments. So it doesn't view the world in as nakedly realist a way as China does. But there is a very strong undercurrent of nationalism in Japan. there is a really great book about the resurgence of Japanese nationalism by a guy named John Nathan. It's called Japan Unbound, A Volatile Nation's Quest for Pride and Purpose. I hope he writes a new edition soon, because this one's about 10 years old, but it's an excellent book. He tells the story of meeting Shintaro Ishihara, who is the governor of Tokyo, not the mayor, the governor of Tokyo, because it's so big, it's basically its own prefecture. He tells the story of going out on a boat with him and talking to a Japanese girl, and Shintaro Ishihara came up to him and lifted him up and threw him off of the boat. He's white dude. Shintaro Ishihara. Yeah. Anyway, so that's a fine book. And so every year, there are visits to Yasukuni Jinja, and China, South Korea protest it quite vigorously, and some of the other tensions between Japan and South Korea and China textbook revisionism is a fairly common issue that comes up. There are a fair number of conservative elites in Japan who want history textbooks or have history textbooks rewritten that greatly diminish assigning responsibility to Japan for the Pacific War. John Nathan tells a story of going to a high school history class and remarking that all of the kids were very surprised to find out that the United States and Japan fought a war. And one kid's question was, who won? So there is textbook revisionism in Japan. It glosses over Japan's aggression and the creation of the Great East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, which was the name of Japan's empire through East and Southeast Asia. Also glosses over another classic issue, which is the Japanese military's use of South Korean comfort women, which refers to the sexual enslavement of hundreds of thousands of South Korean women. So tensions boil beneath the surface because of the war history. Questions, thoughts, comments, concerns about Japan? Yeah.
You said, like, the Article 9 part of Japan where the United States is obligated to protect, like, what is kind of your view on that? Because it sounded like, while I was doing research earlier this year to kind of see what our kind of deal on that was, and I read some stuff that was like the United States would most likely respond in a manner that wasn't as aggressive, that would just kind of neutralize the situation, or is there like a part of Article 9 that is like Japan tells us how they want us to respond, or like?
I actually don't know about what the provisions of Article 9 would say in terms of what the U.S. has to do, because my understanding of Article 9 is that Article 9 strictly just says that Japan doesn't get to have an offensive military, and then the rest of the treaty obligations are spelled out elsewhere, not in Article 9. So I would yeah.
With Abe rewriting the Constitution to redefine the defense forces as with Abe redefining the defense forces as a military force, is that going to impact negatively on China and South Korea?
Probably. Now the question is whether Shinzo Abe for the last how long has he been in office now? For like a year, I think. Yeah. The last year has remarked that he would be open to altering that part of Japan's constitution. He, of course, himself does not have the power to do that unilaterally. And so those public remarks of his are a signal to China and to a lesser extent South Korea and certainly to North Korea of Japan's at least intention to defend itself from hostile neighbors. Shinzo Abe also made headlines fairly recently because every year the Japanese Prime Minister gives a speech commemorating the end of the war and reaffirms Japan's commitment to peace and also apologizes for Japan's role in the Pacific War. Shinzo Abe didn't do that this year. It was the first time in like 20 years that a Japanese Prime Minister has not apologized. So that is another fairly aggressive, hostile signal that the Abe government sends. There is, if you are interested, another really excellent book about post-war Japanese politics called Embracing Defeat, Japan in the Wake of World War II. It's by an excellent historian, John Dower. I think he's at MIT. He also wrote War Without Mercy, Race and Power in World War II. That is mostly about the Pacific Theater. Boring. unless, or do we have any last questions about Japan?
Yeah, how does the United States feel about anti-apologetic?
I don't know that the U.S. has publicly commented on it. I don't know that the feeling in Washington is necessarily whatever, and it's possible that the administration has commented on it, but that has been swamped by headlines about the administration's tie down in Egypt, which is actually where I'm going to go next. So the U.S. pivot to Asia. Hillary Clinton wrote an article in Foreign Affairs. It was called America's Pacific Century. And in this article, Clinton makes the argument that Asia is going to be the next, kind of center of politics for the following century. And because obviously it's a booming economic powerhouse and there are tons and tons of people in Asia. And also, Clinton is making the argument partially that the United States needs to extract itself from the situation it got itself into in the Middle East and Central Asia, because it's no longer in U.S. strategic interests. And so this was the first signal of a change in American diplomatic, military, and economic strategy that has since been termed the pivot to Asia. So John Kerry has been much more muted about the strategic importance of the pivot to Asia. There were supposed to be 2,500 Marines sent to Australia, and I think maybe all of them went, but there was supposed to be a secondary wave of U.S. Marines to Australia that basically got canceled. And a couple of joint military exercises between the U.S. and South Korea have been canceled, and so much has been on John Kerry's plate in terms of not just the situation in Egypt, but also trying to restart the Israel-Palestine negotiations, that his focus appears to be the exact opposite of what I think Hillary Clinton was hoping for, which is he's moving away from Asia back toward trying to ensure peace in the Middle East. That appears to be his focus. And so now you'll find a lot of articles that were written after 2012 that basically ask what happened to the pivot to Asia. So that's kind of an open question. Part of the reason that the pivot to Asia received so much attention was because there was a concern that China would view it as encirclement, which makes a great deal of sense, right? If Chinese policymakers and academics who are writing about the international environment view it mostly in realist terms, of course China would view the pivot to Asia as encirclement. Now, the United States at every turn tries to downplay the concept of it as encirclement. It's just a flowering of a relationship between the United States and Asia. And the United States remains committed to maintaining its relationship with China, and China remains committed to a peaceful rise. And that's most of the official rhetoric surrounding the pivot to Asia. But quite naturally, China would view it as encirclement or a form of containment. Okay, so we've got some time for questions, thoughts, comments, concerns, or diatribes. At the top of the Okay. Oh yeah.
Hotspots for conflict.
Senkaku Diaoyu, obviously. Spratly Islands, Parasols, and the Scarborough Shoal. Also, I don't discuss it very much, but the Shawlaw book actually has a pretty good section on cyber warfare and the possibility of cyber warfare between the United States and China, or at least these private actors in China that seem to be engaged in cyber attacks against U.S. business infrastructure and defense infrastructure. And it's not especially clear the role of the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, in these cyber attacks. It, I think, kind of is hard to believe that the PLA plays no role in it, but the official line is that these are rogue actors. Yeah?
What do you think the role is going to be of the rebellions and attempted revolutions in some countries in Asia, like Thailand? They've been going through, like,
In Thailand?
yeah, they've been having attempts at revolution every few years.
Right. So there was the coup in 2006, right? and a lot of instability. And then there was a coup that followed that a couple of years later, and I think Yingluck Shinawat is still in charge in Thailand, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think the yellow shirts, they like staged a Arab Spring style protest like around the same time as the Arab Spring.
Oh wow. Okay, I didn't know very much about that. That's really interesting. You know, so because I don't know very much about the yellow shirts or the factional politics in Thailand, I'm reluctant to comment on how China is going to react to it. My knee-jerk reaction is because Thailand is, if you were to put it in the sphere of influence of a major power, probably falls more in the U.S. sphere of influence than China's. I'm not sure the degree to which China would care, but I'd be interested to know more about that. Yeah.
Is there a potential flare between China and India at the border, at territorial disputes around?
Oh, that's another good one. That's actually a lesser known or lesser written about part of the pivot to Asia. So, as you're probably aware, there is a fair amount of historical tension between China and India. They fought a war in 1962, and they have at least two major ongoing border disputes that I know of. One of them is Ansar Pradesh, and I forget the other one.
I think it's the happening Kashmir along with the
So ongoing border disputes between China and India, and there was an Economist cover like 2 years ago. There's two massive arms that were about to arm wrestle, and one of them had a dragon tattoo, and the other one had a tiger tattoo. It's China and India, right? And so I think that there is a, at least a popular sentiment that the two will compete economically and politically, and the United States has formally asked India, Obama asked Manmohan Singh, who's the Prime Minister of India, to play a greater role in the Asian security architecture, which you would think China would only view as another type of encirclement or containment strategy. And because the United States sells so many weapons to India, a formal request that it play a greater role in the security architecture of the region, I think could kind of only be interpreted one way. Now the question of whether China and India would actually go to war over those disputed territories, it seems unlikely to occur. Really high costs for kind of low payoff. Right, yeah.
Just really quick, do you think the naval exercises that occasionally spark up occasional tension, do you think they have any diplomatic impact at all? Like,
Sure. Like what do you mean diplomatic impact?
Like display of strength and whether or not that shows a threat to China or North Korea.
Yeah, I mean there's signals. So there's signals of resolve. Those types of joint naval exercises, they're signals of alliance. They're signals of resolve. And they can also be displays of exactly which side has which firepower, or what degree of firepower. But my feeling is because those flare-ups occur so frequently without actually spilling over into battle, that's more of a form of political theater than an actual, I guess, flashpoint for a war impact. But that's more of a personal thing. Okay. I'm here all day. So, thanks.